Welcome everybody who's beginning to log in. Welcome to our webinar. We're so glad to see you here. We're going to spend a few minutes just letting people get logged on and ready. So I'll just be talking while you do that. But I am going to, let me see. We would love to know as well, just I'm going to launch this poll if you can see it as it pops up. We just kind of want to know how you found your way to this webinar series, and we're so glad to see you here today. We've got Professor Luke Harding from Lancaster University with us. And in just a few moments, I'll introduce my colleague, Anthony Coonan, who will say a few words before we begin. And just to say a few things before we begin. So as a webinar, if you're watching this, you don't really have access to your camera or your microphone, but feel free to use the chat to leave comments and ask questions, and then also the Q&A function. If you have questions, I'll be reading those out after Professor Harding's lecture. So if you have questions for him, please submit them there, and then we'll do a little a Q&A session after the webinar has begun. Oh, somebody tells me the chat is disabled. Oh, that's, you know what, that's in service of the Q&A. That's purposeful. So please use the Q&A for questions. That's what we'll do. I remembered that I did that. So the Q&A is where you can ask any questions for Professor Harding at any time while he's speaking. He won't be able to see or hear you, obviously, but we're very eager for your comments and your feedback on this talk. And I'll just give people another couple minutes, and then I'll introduce Anthony Kuhn. Let's see, and thank you to those of you who are filling out our little entry poll to tell us how you found out about the webinar and the webinar series. And I'll say a few words. Yes, so this is the third installment of this webinar series, Innovations in Language Assessment. Previously, we have had talks by Eunice Chang and James Purpura, and today we have Professor Luke Harding. In a couple months' time, we'll be welcoming Kim Kang also to speak. And we'll have these once a quarter, so every few months. And we're very happy to have you here. I think the time has come for me to introduce my colleague, who really needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. Professor Anthony Coonan. Dr. Anthony Coonan, would you like to say a few words?
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the webinar series. This is the third in the series, as Sophie, my colleague, just pointed out. We've had two distinguished professors, and today we have another distinguished professor, Professor Luke Harding from Lancaster University. I'll say a few words about his research interests. His research interests are listening assessment, and particularly the role of speaker accent, pronunciation assessment, and intelligibility, English as lingua franca, and communicative language assessment, which is the topic of today's talk, language assessment literacy, and diagnostic language assessment. In addition to these research interests, Luke has published extensively in journals, in books, and he's also the editor, co-editor of Language Testing. He's been the co-editor for a while. And he's engaged in many research projects for different organizations and in different countries. I won't take up any more time right now. So welcome, Luke.
Thank you, Anthony. And thank you, Sophie. And hello to everybody out there. I think, as Sophie said earlier, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A place, and we'll collate those and answer them at the end of the talk. But feel free to put a question there at any point during the talk if something occurs to you, or something pops into your mind. So thank you for the introduction. My name is Luke Harding, and the title of my talk today is English as a Lingua Franca and Language Assessment, Where Are We Now? And what I'm going to do in this talk is just I guess, cover some of my thinking about this topic that's been developing over the past, well, more than 10 years now, but perhaps just take a sort of view of how things stand currently in the field with respect to this topic and where we might be heading. I'll just mention where I'm based. So greetings from Lancaster. If you don't know, if you've not been, Lancaster is in the United Kingdom. It's a bit over an hour north of Manchester, as you can see on that map, and the southern tip of the Lake District. And here are some images from around Lancaster. It's a very beautiful place, as you can see. The outline of my talk is going to be divided into 4 parts. So I'm going to start by just giving a very back to basics background to English as a lingua franca. Then I'm going to talk a bit about ELF, as I'll probably use this acronym quite a bit, ELF in current language assessment practice, then defining and operationalizing an ELF construct. And then in the final section, I want to talk a bit about technology and ELF in assessment and consider constraints and affordances. And I hope that will open up some interesting topics for discussion at the end of the talk. So let's get started with a background to English as a lingua franca. So a good definition of ELF is from Seidelhofer, which is any use of English among speakers of different first languages for whom English is the communicative medium of choice and often the only option. So people often talk about the typical ELF exchange, maybe a business person from Japan meeting a business person from Germany and needing to find a common language and using English. But actually, this definition also encompasses a whole range of situations, including interactions between L1 users and L2 users of English, as well as L2 users and L2 users. So that's the sort of basic definition that we're starting from. If you have read much of the ELF literature, you will probably know that early studies of English as a lingua franca typically treated it as a variety. So they attempted to describe regular features of ELF, and these were in areas such as phonology, and many of you may be familiar with Jennifer Jenkins' Lingua Franca core for pronunciation. That was an example of trying to kind of characterize ELF as a particular kind of variety, lexicogrammar and pragmatics. But that was the sort of early period of ELF research, and that has since given way to a current focus, which has shifted to trying to understand what makes communication successful in fluid and dynamic contexts of language use, contexts of language use which involve interlocutors, interactants from different lingua-cultural backgrounds. And so a nice definition of this more kind of current view of ELF is given by Dewey, who says that ELF is then best understood as a dynamic, locally realized enactment of a global resource, best conceptualized not as a uniform set of norms or practices, but as a highly variable creative expression of linguistic resources. So this view of ELF poses 2 challenges for language assessment. And in a chapter in 2018 that I co-authored with Tim McNamara, we kind of set out these different challenges. So the first challenge is that L1 speaker norms should no longer be considered the standard in language assessment. So if we take a view of ELF as being an important type of language practice, then we have to acknowledge and recognize that L1 speaker norms are not kind of should not be centralized in our discussions of what good communication is. Now, this is actually quite an old critique of language testing. When I say old, I mean it goes back beyond ELF into the World Englishes paradigm, some very influential papers by Lowenberg in the early 1990s, for example. This critique has been going now for over 30 years. And it's a really important critique because it says that tests need to be very cautious about, for example, measuring formal correctness in grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation against so-called native-like norms. It also speaks to the selection of a range of accents for listening, and this challenge would suggest that we need a wide and diverse variety of accents in listening assessment, which is something that I've been interested in pursuing in some of my own research. So this is the first challenge, I think, that we should sort of displace L1 speaker norms in language testing and assessment, and embrace the sociolinguistic variability that is out there in the world of English language communication. The second challenge actually represents a shift away from more traditional models of language testing, and the fluid nature of communicative interaction becomes the kind of key issue here. So challenge 2 is that language assessment is actually wrongly focused on judging against a stable variety at all. And this is nicely summed up by Jenkins and Lung, who say the language assessment issues raised by ELF transcend questions of proficiency conceptualized in terms of a stable variety. So they're concerned with what counts as effective and successful communication outcomes through the use of English that can include emergent and innovative forms of language and pragmatic meaning. So this is a somewhat more radical perspective on what ELF means for language assessment. It suggests that we need to move away from a view of language proficiency as a fixed ability and to focus more on linguistic repertoires, communication strategies, and the kind of flexibility that allows for adaptable language use in these kind of ELF environments. And someone who I've been kind of strongly influenced by in my own thinking on these issues is Suresh Kanagaraja. And he wrote a very, very thought-provoking paper back in 2006, which I recommend anyone to read if you haven't already, called Changing Communicative Needs, Revised Assessment Objectives. And in that, he describes a kind of new view of proficiency, where he says, in a context where we have to constantly shuttle between different varieties and communities, proficiency becomes complex. One needs the capacity to negotiate diverse varieties to facilitate communication, and the passive competence to understand new varieties. So there's very much a focus here on, as I said earlier, flexibility, adaptability, and being able to navigate these different communicative encounters with different speakers. Now, we can look at the literature. There has been quite a lot of literature, not necessarily within language testing and assessment, but from an ELF paradigm and other kind of global Englishes and world Englishes paradigms that we can draw upon to understand what are some of the elements of ELF communication that seem to emerge as important for this kind of adaptability, this kind of meaning making in these kinds of situations. So if we look at some of the research from the ELF tradition, we can see accommodation is a very important aspect of ELF communication. So making yourself intelligible to an interlocutor, making yourself understood, and also adjusting to your interlocutor's speech style their accent, their way of communicating. So that accommodation is really key. Then also using strategies to preempt or to negotiate misunderstandings. And these are sort of classically clarification, self-repair, repetition and paraphrasing. And then also maintaining a smooth and collaborative interaction, even if communication becomes challenging. And this includes, of course, turn-taking, using appropriate politeness strategies, and also creative language use. So perhaps coining new terms or phrases that make sense within a particular encounter that you're involved in. If we look at Kanagaraja, there's a sort of slightly broader set of competences, if you like, that he raises as being important for this kind of proficiency. Capacity to negotiate diverse varieties, negotiation skills, accommodation again, proficiency in pragmatics, dialect differentiation, code switching, style shifting, interpersonal communication, conversation management, discourse strategies. All of these are to be kind of made more prominent in this view of ELF competence or ELF proficiency. Okay, so that's a kind of background to what ELF is and where we are now, and what are some of the sort of themes, the common themes that are discussed in ELF research and so on. So I want to move on to looking at ELF in current language assessment practice. And this is where I'm going to call on Sophie, because I have a poll. There's a poll function, and we're going to put a poll. It'll pop up somewhere. Here we go. So please fill in that poll. And your question is, to what extent do you think ELF is captured or assessed in current English language tests? Very well, a little, not at all, or I'm still not really sure what ELF is, so I don't know. I'll give you a minute to do that. And then Sophie, where do we see results?
So I'll give people a minute to kind of fill it out. And once we've got a good portion of those who've responded, I'll end the poll and I'll share the results. So you'll be able to see it.
Okay.
I think along with everybody else.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Problem.
Okay. And we've got a question in the chat from Beata, and we'll come back to that, I think, at the end.
Yes. So we've got a good, we're almost everybody's responded, but I'll just give it one more second.
Okay, that was a good question to ask.
Okay. Well, I'm going to give it a full minute and then I'm going to end it. All right, I'm going to end it now, and I will share the results.
Okay, interesting. So I was kind of thinking, I was predicting that it would be something like a little or not at all. And one person said very well, which is great. And we can talk about that later. And also a few people have said, I'm still not really sure what ELF is. So please keep listening, and it might, that understanding might develop. But great, yes, I kind of agree with the people who said a little. And so we'll go on to have a look at that. So thank you, Sophie, for that. So let's think about how aware are we in the field of ELF? So there's been a lot of commentary on the topic of ELF, the topic of world Englishes generally, global Englishes in language testing and assessment. All of those references there in blue indicate people who have kind of written a commentary, some sort of conceptual overview of the situation. So there's quite a lot of discussion about this. There is also, in some areas, a pretty solid empirical research base. So one of the areas I mentioned earlier, which is the use of diverse accents in listening assessment, even just within the past 5 years, those studies that are cited there have just appeared since 2018 on this topic of the use of different accents in listening assessment. So we are developing quite a lot of research, quite a lot of understanding about things. And, I think that we are developing in certain topics a solid empirical research base. There has also been a shift away from a sort of deliberate shift away from concepts such as nativeness in frameworks and in rating scales. And a good example is the CFR companion volume with new descriptors. So this is, I guess many of you will be familiar with the Common European Framework of Reference, which is an important framework of language proficiency. And in 2018, there was a sort of companion volume released, which sort of made some changes to the original 2001 set of descriptors. And one of the really interesting things that they did was they sort of went through and removed all references to native speakers, native-like, this kind of thing. And you can actually find on page 223 of that document in an appendix a kind of track-changed view of how they did this. And this is an example of what they did for one of the scales on understanding conversation between what's now understanding conversation between speakers. So we can see here a kind of deliberate shift away from a nativeness sort of approach and principle towards something much more focused on expert users and exceptional learners and so on. But has that filtered into language testing practice? I think in many ways it hasn't, particularly in the large scale international tests. So if we look at these kind of big four tests, IELTS, TOEFL, Duolingo, PTE Academic, which are currently operating around the world, we can see that accents on listening sections tend to be still confined to what are often known as inner circle varieties of British, North American, Australian, New Zealand, English. With the Duolingo English test, I wonder if there's anyone who wants to put in the chat. I couldn't find an exact list of accents on the listening tasks, but I believe it's North American and possibly also British. PTE Academic has perhaps the widest range of accents according to information about that test. But in terms of spoken interaction and the sort of opportunities to demonstrate some of those competences that we've been talking about already, there's also limitations. IELTS does have spoken interaction, but quite a rigid interlocutor frame for examiners. And the other three tests, being computer delivered, have constraints on the amount of spoken interaction that can occur. Now, there has been some quite understandable conservatism, I guess, and concern around stability, fairness, and acceptability of, a wide range of varieties of English for test takers. And to some extent, I think that has driven caution. But as I said earlier, we do have quite a solid research base now. And I think personally, I think it's time to move into doing rather than researching and thinking about it. Because the rationale from the domain is so powerful. So we know from the research that ELF communication is a clear feature of many specific purpose target language use domains. So there's documented empirical evidence of ELF communication in aviation, in diplomacy and international relations, in business communication, in health communication, call center communication, and very importantly, English medium instruction in higher education. Now, I say very importantly because EMI higher education is really expanding and becoming a very prominent topic in our field of applied linguistics generally. And of course, many of the large-scale tests are being used for admissions and screening purposes in EMI contexts, which are not North American, not UK, but maybe Nepal, Sweden, or Lebanon, for example. And there is, I think, a very big question to ask about the connection between those domains of language use and the characteristics of the tests that are being used to screen for readiness to study in those settings. I mean, my personal view is that recognizing sociolinguistic diversity or heterogeneity is not just a nice to have feature, it is a fundamental characteristic of all domains of language use. And if we are to take a sort of principled approach, moving from a domain analysis, and Yin and Miss Levy have a very nice definition of what a domain analysis is here: the forms, meanings, and use, assemblies of knowledge, skills and competencies that language learners typically engage with in target language use situations, and features of tasks that invoke them. If we are serious about moving from the domain to test design, then I think we need to kind of revisit the domain, describe these domains, and take notice of what is this research is telling us about what these domains are like. Now, this is particularly important to strengthen the domain description inference in new contexts of test use. So a test that perhaps is originally designed for a North American context, if it's being used elsewhere, we need to investigate that domain and create, a new validity argument. Now, this is important because the evidence that is being generated is suggesting that many EMI contexts are quite different to some of the domain analyses that might underpin existing tests. So a case study is that in a collaboration with Miriam Ilievitz, a PhD student at Lancaster who's been researching language use in a university in Lebanon, John Pill and I worked with Miriam on a recently published paper, which is in the Journal of English Medium Instruction, open access, so you can go and have a look at it if you like, on language use at the American University of Beirut. And this drawing on data collected as part of Miriam's PhD study, where a range of classes were observed in that university. And what emerged from those observations, field notes, recordings, and so on, was a whole range of ELF-oriented practices. So there was evidence, for example, of creativity in language use. There's an example there of somebody saying deep argumentizing, language creativity in language use being a very sort of unproblematic aspect of communication in that setting. And also negotiation and co-construction of meaning as being a feature of communication in that EMI context. There was also, I should add, a lot of evidence of translingual practices between English and Arabic, and also meta-commentary around language use. So in a way, language policy being decided or negotiated on the ground in those classrooms. It's a fascinating set of data and a very interesting study. But we can learn from this that the domains in EMI contexts are rich and complex and deserve to be revisited. Now, there is stuff happening. I mean, it's not necessarily the case, I think, that nobody's sort of acknowledging ELF or moving towards ELF and so on. I think that there's people approaching the same kind of problems, but from different angles. And in a way, there's parallel and converging paradigms at the moment. So two particular approaches, and some of you may well have been thinking about this already, is that the current interest in assessing interactional competence and pragmatic competence has some very significant overlaps with some of what we've been discussing so far. Particularly, I think there's a confluence of priorities in ELF and interactional competence research through this notion of recipient design. And Rofa and Casper describe this as, in terms of interactional competence, foregrounding a sociolinguistic interactional perspective requires tasks that can elicit purposeful interactive language use to provide evidence about test takers' ability to tailor their talk to their interlocutor and the situation, a principle known as recipient design, and participate in interaction. So there's a strong kind of similarity in that recipient design perspective with what has been discussed in terms of ELF. So there's a lot of work at the moment on interactional competence, pragmatic competence in language testing and assessment, and this is all, I think, heading in a very positive direction. But I think there may still be some distinctions, between an ELF approach and an interactional competence approach, where the ELF approach really does foreground or place very centrally this notion of a fluid and dynamic context, which is kind of intersubjectively constructed within each interaction. But I think there's a lot to learn from each other, in these different perspectives. But it's worth noting as well that I think interactional competence is another area which has been, very, very deeply researched, but isn't necessarily gaining as much traction as it could in some of the larger scale tests. But in terms of integrating principles of ELF itself, there is actually, quite a lot of work happening out there beyond the big tests, the big international tests. It tends to be happening at the local level, in localized testing or in well-defined LSP environments. For example, some of the work of David Newbold, who's been working on this kind of topic for a long time. He has a very interesting paper on co-certification of an English test jointly developed by Trinity College London and a university in Italy. And essentially, a Trinity College London test was localized within an Italian context, introduction of L2 accents in listening, for example, and this was all found to be unproblematic and uncontroversial. So these kind of localization projects are happening. Similarly, Joanna Motteram, working with the British Council, reported on a project to localize listening assessments used in Singapore for a defined purpose with local accents of English. So there is this kind of interest, I think, at the moment in taking, I guess, the fundamentals of a test and moving it into a different context and making adjustments so that it works kind of at the local level to recognize and acknowledge the kind of sociolinguistic environment in which that test is being used. And again, I think these are positive developments. But I think you would perhaps agree that at least in these two cases, we're still talking about, if you remember back to challenge 1, so this idea that we need to kind of shift away from an L1 speaker norm. But it's a bit less clear, I think, at the moment how challenge 2 is being addressed, and perhaps because challenge 2 is incredibly challenging to think about. But that's what we're going to do next, where we think about defining and operationalizing an ELF construct. So, Sophie, another poll is ready. And this one is asking the question, do you think it's possible to assess the kinds of lingua franca competence we have been discussing so far? So your answers here are yes, definitely. No, it's too difficult. Probably, but I'd need to think about it more. Or probably, but I'd rather someone else figured out how to do it and not me. So think about it, but you don't have to think about it too much. It's not a test. I'm always conscious, Sophie, while we're waiting, that when it's an audience of language testers, I think these poll items are probably being critiqued internally, by by the participants. But if you want,
It's
you can
possible, but-
you can tell me later on if you think some rewording.
Oh no, I
would have been
think
good.
this is good. And we've got I'll give it another few seconds. We've got a pretty high
Yeah.
response rate here.
Great.
I wonder what I wonder if it will align with your expectations. I'm gonna
Yeah.
share it.
Okay. Yes. Okay. That's what I was hoping. Probably, but I'd need to think about it more. It's come out on top there, which I was kind of anticipating, and I'm happy about that. I'm not surprised that some people would rather someone else figure it out, because it is a bit of a headache in a way. Yes, definitely, and a few people think it is too difficult. But let's see if you agree as we continue on. So thank you, Sophie. If we wanted to develop a test of ELF, or something that would move from that kind of research-based understanding of what ELF is, we need to kind of go from theory to design. So the nature of the construct, Messick says, the nature of the construct guides the selection or construction of relevant tasks, as well as the rational development of construct-based scoring criteria and rubrics. So we need to sort of go back to our theory. And if we think about these kind of key elements of what ELF communication involves, we can sort of use that as a basis to move forward into developing an ELF construct. Now, in our 2018 chapter, Tim and I kind of tried to map this out, almost a sort of conceptual experiment, I guess, of thinking, okay, what would this translate into in terms of a construct? And so the ability to tolerate and comprehend different varieties of English, so different accents, different syntactic forms, different discourse styles, the ability to negotiate meaning when meaning is ambiguous, the ability to use phonological features, which are crucial for intelligibility across speakers of different L1 backgrounds, an awareness of appropriate pragmatics, the ability to accommodate your interlocutor, so to make yourself understandable to whomever you're speaking with, and the ability to notice and repair breakdowns in communication. So these are sort of abilities that are extrapolated from this research literature. And from there, we can think about, okay, what kind of task and what sort of setting would allow for these sorts of abilities to be captured? And again, in that chapter, we kind of thought through what an appropriate task, an appropriate rubric might entail. So the task we thought would need to be interactive and goal-oriented. So people need to have to communicate and manage communication and get over any challenges. It would need to elicit negotiation of form and meaning. Breakdowns in communication would need to be anticipated through this task. So there would basically need to be a task where meaning must be co-constructed by two or more interlocutors, and where complications are built in, because we want to assess what happens around those complications. Then the setup, interlocutors don't know each other, ideally, and also interlocutors have little familiarity with each other's L1 or lingua cultural background. This is the sort of classic ELF scenario, if you like. And then in terms of rating criteria which prioritize and reward strategies required for successful ELF communication, because many tests may already do some of what is discussed, in terms of the task, in terms of a task with complication and so on. But there also needs to be rating criteria that value, the very specific communication strategies and so on that would allow for these misunderstandings or communication breakdowns to be overcome. Okay, so how could we sort of capture this? Well, in some of my other thinking, been considering different options for an academic ELF assessment task, and in a few different places. I've tried out different tasks or worked with people who've been working on tasks that could be useful. And we can conceptualize this as moving from the less authentic to the more authentic. So if we consider, for example, at the less authentic end, a map task, an information gap task, two-way, where you can very carefully design what interlocutors need to do to be able to complete that task, and sort of build in particular complications or challenges that they need to overcome. This task is used, in a lot of different research, SLA research, communication research, and so on. And it can elicit accommodation, repetition, repair, but it is quite an inauthentic task, telling someone how to, get to the hidden valley around the pond or whatever. Okay, so it's not to everybody's taste. Then we might have a crossword task, which I'll talk about in a minute, slightly less artificial, but again, a jigsaw task, three-way, but what does it elicit? And then, a more open decision-making task, which would involve consensus building and require perhaps verbal and non-verbal pragmatic behavior. I just want to talk to you briefly about this crossword task as, something that I explored, and something that could potentially be interesting to others working or who want to work on ELF assessment. So the idea here is that, three different people take part in a task. There's three different crosswords, but there's a design here so that, different people have different words provided to them, different letters are given in some cases, and there's also, some things that don't quite make sense that need to be negotiated and overcome. And I piloted this task with 4 different groups, 3 people in each group, all from diverse kind of lingua cultural backgrounds. All participants didn't know each other previously. And I want to also point out here that the groups included both L1 and L2 speakers, because as I said earlier, the definition of ELF includes L1 speakers, and we mustn't just assume that L1 speakers of English are automatically very competent ELF speakers. In many cases, they may not be. And so it's kind of interesting and useful to include them in the assessment process as well. So these 4 groups all took part in this task. They completed the task, they completed a post-task questionnaire, and they, in a way, kind of self-assessed what happened in their own group interaction. Because, of course, that's very important. We want the participants to, if the participants are developing and negotiating the rules of the encounter, if you like, then they're the ones who are best placed to tell us what worked and what didn't work and where things broke down and so on. And then I also, out of interest to see whether a task like this could actually be kind of rated or judged, I brought in 4 ELF expert judges. So these weren't sort of typical language assessment raters. These were actually all published ELF researchers, and I was interested in getting them to watch videos of these performances and identify features and phenomena in those encounters that they found interesting and noteworthy, and that could somehow distinguish very strong and effective ELF communicators from less strong, and so on. And so they took part in a sort of judgment task where they judged the groups, they rated individuals, and they also gave some more sort of qualitative feedback about what they noticed in each performance. Now, in terms of the speakers' own kind of self-ratings, speakers all tended to judge their own interactions pretty well. And I have to say, they all did a very good job on the task. Some were incredibly smooth, you know, at working together, and others were a little bit bumpier, if you like, but everybody managed to kind of get there in the end. So there was a fairly strong consensus that the groups, within the groups themselves, that they operated quite well. Some of the speakers, what they said about interacting within their group, where there were misunderstandings, they tended to be phonological, they tended to be intelligibility issues. So distinguishing between different consonants and particularly T and D, S and X, and then some evidence that speakers were also mindful of accommodation. So one person saying, yes, I had to speak a lot slower to focus on clear pronunciation to make sure I was understood. Now, here's an example. This is actually a sort of recording of an interaction within one of these tasks. And you can see here a really nice example, I think, of accommodation from two speakers. So on the one hand, one speaker is sort of asking some, or requesting clarification, and then another speaker uses a sort of slightly more creative way of solving the problem around not quite being able to determine, you know, a particular consonant sound. So I'm just going to click here and hopefully you'll be able to hear this.
6 across.
I got the flat stones used for inscription, and I got the first letter as T, the last letter as an S.
What was the first letter?
T.
T for what is it?
Tango.
Right.
Okay, so you can see here just a very nice, smooth resolution to what might have been, you know, a difficult problem that would have impacted upon the task. And this is kind of, you know, very good evidence, I think, that both of those speakers were highly effective communicators. Okay, so in terms of the judges, the rationales that they came up with were very much in line with the kind of ELF research that we've covered already. They noticed things to do with intelligibility, accommodation, paraphrasing, requests for clarification, repetition, repair, listening actively, interpersonal pragmatic strategies, and so on. And there was a sort of orientation towards more transactional content oriented, so getting the task done, getting the message across, and also the more interactional, interpersonal, relation-oriented goals. So making things nice, making things smooth, using politeness, and so on. And so this is an interesting division, I think, between different kinds of ELF competences that might have some resonance in different settings, where interpersonal pragmatics might be more or less important. I'm just going to skip that for time and just talk a little bit about the next steps of this particular project, which is obviously to sort of gather more samples and, you know, use some more ratings and flesh out initial descriptors and so on. But the idea is to sort of develop a suite of tasks that might be useful for eliciting these kinds of communicative behaviors. But as you can see, the problem with the crossword task is that it is still quite artificial, right? It's still very much based on linguistic resources. But as we move to the more authentic tasks, it actually becomes apparent that the construct becomes a lot more complex, and interactants make meaning in ELF contexts using both verbal and non-verbal resources. So in terms of this decision-making task, I just want to briefly say something about this. So in a study that I did with Anuchit Tumani-Jinder, this study was looking at disagreement in ELF academic group discussion. And in this study, 6 postgraduate students from different linguacultural backgrounds all took part in different tasks, and their interactions were recorded. This again, was a very interesting data set. But they were also video recorded. And then the participants reflected on the videos, so during a sort of stimulated recall procedure. So we, through that data, there were some glimpses of what was going on inside the participants' minds at the time of certain points of interaction. And it reveals a very fascinating, but kind of, for language assessment, challenging perspective on this kind of interaction. So in one example, there was a task where the students had to discuss a funding, a sort of funding allocation. And this is based on actually a task developed originally by Andrea Reves. And they had a sort of limited amount of money, and they had to decide which opportunities to fund as a committee. And it was supposed to generate disagreement, and it did, actually. In one point in this interaction, one speaker had sort of spoken up to support funding a walk to improve mental health as one of the sort of funding options to be to use the money. This speaker here, Catalina, in our study, you can see her here in 4 different frames. She didn't say anything in this at this point. She was silent, but she turned her head and made eye contact with this participant at the bottom of the frame, who we call Jimmy. And in the stimulated recall data, she said, yeah, I looked at Jimmy for a while. We were laughing at her, not laughing at her, but just laughing about the walk, which we think is stupid. Now, obviously, this is a disagreement. She was disagreeing with the proposition of a walk, but she didn't articulate it verbally. What she did do, however, was use nonverbal behavior to make eye contact with Jimmy, and in doing so, formed an alliance, a sort of oppositional alliance. And this happened quite a few times on other points as well in this interaction. And we can all probably relate to this as well from meetings we've been in and so on. Gaze and nonverbal behavior became incredibly important for expressing and managing disagreement within this environment. So I think that, my current thinking about the construct is that it's actually sort of expanding, getting bigger, and in some ways, again, overlapping with these other concerns that are coming out of research on interactional competence more generally, about verbal and non-verbal behavior. And Dylan Burton at Michigan State University is doing some very interesting work on non-verbal behavior and interactional competence as well. We also need to, I think, consider the role of silence, meaningful silence, known as speech act silence, or the let it pass principle. How does silence manifest itself within these ELF encounters? And what does it mean for us as assessors? How do we tap into the meaningfulness of silence? We need to consider ways in which impoliteness and uncooperativeness is expressed or managed, which is also very important. And there's also large potential for overlap, as I said, with current concerns in discussions of interactional competence. So this is where we are with the construct, I think, kind of at a difficult point. But let's move on to our final section, which is technology and ELF in assessment, constraints and affordances. So, Sophie, poll number 3 is, do you think new technology in language assessment, example, automated scoring, spoken dialogue systems, etc., creates constraints or opportunities for assessing lingua franca competences? And just 3 choices this time. So mostly constraints, mostly opportunities, or constraints now, but opportunities when the technology improves.
It's going all over the place right now. See how else they
This
come.
could be the item that discriminates well between the group. Okay.
It's very interactive. Let's see. I'm going to give it about another half minute for everyone to
Mhm.
reply. But it's moving around a lot, so. We'll give it about another 10 seconds. I think
Mhm.
it seems like it stopped moving. Last call, everyone, if you want to reply to this. Okay. Here we have it.
Okay. Very interesting. Thank you, Sophie, and thanks to everyone who voted. Great. Yeah. So the most popular answer there is constraints now, but opportunities when the technology improves. And I also would probably agree with that. Let's have a look briefly, because I'm conscious of the time, but there are, I think, two ways of looking at it. So current constraints and threats. There are, I think, at the moment, some constraints and threats on trying to kind of realize ELF competence, if you like to call it that, or a more ELF aware type of assessment. And these are in sort of three different ways. And when I say constraints, I'm talking about constraints with new technology, avoiding complex constructs, favoring computational easiness, and promoting risk-averse language behavior. So on that first point, we know that at the moment, fully automated speaking assessments, computer-delivered computer scores, may necessarily, in a way, constrain what can be captured or measured. So typically, there's a need to use more controlled tasks so that the computer can score more efficiently and more accurately. There's less option for interaction, and there's less chance for extemporaneous speech. So often it's much easier to score speech that the machine is expecting. Not always the case, and I know that these technologies are improving all the time, but I think traditionally these have been the constraints of, particularly in terms of speaking assessment, computer delivered and scored language tests. Another one is favoring computational easiness, and I really like this quote from Van Moore and Suzuki, and I've used it in some other presentations as well, where they say, and this is related to automated scoring. So from a software modeling point of view, the option of having just one variety of English as the reference would be the easiest computational way to discriminate very accurately among learners who have the pronunciation and those who do not. But as more accents and pronunciations are included in the reference model, it becomes more ambiguous and poorer at discriminating among learners. So decisions made at the stage of the reference, selecting the reference corpus or building the reference corpus, reflect and embed values within the scoring system. And there's this sort of risk here that language ideologies and native speaker, native centrism, if you like, can be embedded at this early design stage, and then lead to, in a way, potential discrimination, later down the track. Now, I know that, testing organizations with more resources and so on are often or are good at understanding this and selecting features and that reflect constructs and using more diverse reference corpora and so on. But it's not the case everywhere, and there has been a proliferation of, for example, pronunciation learning apps, which very much rely on a proximity to native-like pronunciation, which I think is, and I've said this elsewhere, is sort of sending us backwards conceptually. And then the third issue is promoting risk-averse language behavior. So scoring algorithms are often, kind of black box. We don't necessarily know, as test takers, test score users, how they work. And if we don't know exactly what feeds into them, this may promote risk-averse behavior. So the uncertainty itself sustains a kind of ideological hegemony in the perceived construct. So whether that's real or not, this influences test taker behavior. So it may also promote test taking strategies that are actively at odds with the kind of ELF interactional values. So a very interesting study by Knock et al. And Knock College at Melbourne University looked at PTE Academic, a fully automated speaking test, and found that coaches, test preparation coaches were advising candidates to reduce pausing in speech, speak faster, more clearly and loudly, and avoid hesitations and fillers such as ums and ahs, and that this would somehow sort of promote their scores and you know, crack the machine. Now, whether or not this actually worked is less clear, but it just goes to show that the beliefs about the scoring system, or at least the absence of transparency about a scoring system, can lead to more undesirable test preparation behaviors. Okay, but there are opportunities, and we're getting to the end now, so these are good to end on because we can talk about these as well in the Q&A. I think the three opportunities that I could think of, and I'm sure there are many more: greater scope for choice in language varieties, greater scope for capturing accommodation or communication strategies, and new sites of ELF interaction. So on the first one, scope for choice. So technology theoretically provides us with greater chance for test taker agency. You could imagine a computer delivered test where the candidate is presented with an option, select the variety you would like to take the test in today. And they may want to choose you know, a local variety of English, North American variety, British English, whatever. This would give the test taker a say. And of course, this would have great impact on assessing oral language skills across different socio-linguistic contexts. The problem with this, and I have reservations about it, is that it could simply promote a kind of essentialized, you know, set of norms and models of different nature, and in fact move us away from the ELF principles of, you know, adaptability, flexibility, and so on. But it's an interesting idea to consider, I think, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on it as well. Another one, and I think this is perhaps the more kind of obvious direction that things are heading in, is greater scope for capturing accommodation and communication strategies through interaction with either spoken dialogue systems or, you know, AI assistants. So there is great scope, I think, for modeling challenges and complications through adaptive spoken dialogue systems. And there's, you know, really interesting work being done by Gary Ockey and colleagues at Iowa State about spoken dialogue systems, and some findings suggesting that there might be more opportunities for, you know, repair and accommodation skills to kind of be promoted through this kind of interaction with spoken dialogue systems. And of course, the more advanced these systems become, the more they may be able to, in a way, adapt to the abilities of the interlocutor and perhaps pose more challenging, more complicated, you know, interactional problems to solve, if that's something that we would want to do. Similarly, interactions with AI assistants, and interesting study by Musali and Cardoso has already found that, you know, interacting with an AI assistant can again require these kinds of communication strategies, which are very much, you know, aligned with the kinds of strategies we've been talking about. But you know, at the same time, I think we need to recognize that these kinds of interactions may be quite different in type compared with face-to-face interactional competence. And you know, Veronica Timpe-Lachlan has been doing, you know, really interesting work on pragmatics and spoken dialogue systems and so on. And there's some suggestions in some of her work that you know, the kinds of interactional behaviors that happen with a human interlocutor may be quite different with a spoken dialogue system. But at the same time, as we move into a world where we are communicating more with computers, these things become construct relevant in their own way. So that's something interesting to talk about as well. And finally, new sites of ELF interaction. So we can be starting to think about group chat and ELF interaction in group chat. Chat is a really interesting kind of halfway point between sort of spoken and written modality, multimodal, you're using images and memes and all sorts of things. It's a fascinating area, I think, to explore. Online gaming, of course, and virtual reality, which, perhaps could start to bring in some of these non-verbal features of communication that are so, elusive in many of our spoken test constructs. So I'm very, excited to see what you might put in the chat as well, because, I think many of you will probably have fantastic ideas and things you're working on and things you've been thinking about yourselves. But I'm going to draw to a close here with a final poll. And that final poll is, having heard this talk, how would you characterize your stance on English as a lingua franca and language assessment? So A, we need to make some changes right now. B, I'm not convinced it's all that important. C, it's a challenging issue, but we need to make more progress. Or D, my views are complicated and I'm going to write them in the chat or in the Q&A. So we'll have a minute.
I'll tell you what, I'll let that run
that.
for a little bit and maybe I will,
Yep.
should I ask you a question from the Q&A?
Yeah, let's do that. We'll start with, start with the question. Great.
Yes. All right. So I'll just do them in the order in which they were received. So one person asks, can we teach AI to be able to assess and give meaningful feedback on various Englishes?
Yeah, great question. I don't think I'm probably the person with the answer to this, but it's quite possible that someone in the audience will have a good answer to this who knows a lot more about current AI capabilities. I like to think that this is going to be possible. I think, again, it comes back to the issue of how do we teach the AI to have the same kind of flexibility and the same kind of understanding of language variability that, a human interlocutor might have, rather than, using a kind of computational approach of proximity to a native-like pronunciation, let's say. I don't know how things are going with respect to, what these AI engines can do at the moment, but, I'm sure it's possible and I'm sure it's being looked at, but I'd be very interested if anyone in the audience has, sort of a more up-to-date answer on how this is going. Yeah, so someone's recommended to see Shungo Suzuki's work. And that's, thank you, Hitoshi. That's a great suggestion. And Shungo is Lancaster graduate who we're very proud of. He's doing fantastic work now in Japan. And so, I recommend you to look up some of his work. He is, yes, very interested in these kinds of issues as well. Thank you.
Yes. I've got another question for you here. So it's a question about the future of interactional competence. How do we move to further decenter a native standard from this idea that some can be interactionally incompetent or low in competence, just as we decenter nativeness from other constructs in proficiency? How does interactional competence follow suit?
Okay, so is that the question from Bianca? Yeah,
yes,
I'm just, okay, thank you, Bianca. So how do we move to further decenter a native standard from this area and that some can be, or low in competence, just as we decenter nativeness from other constructs in proficiency? How does interaction? Yeah, okay, this is a great question, actually, and you've kind of put your finger on something that I wanted to say and probably should have said when I was talking about the differences that I see between kind of interactional competence and ELF competence, if you like, which is this some research, and I don't think all research, but some research on interactional competence and pragmatic competence for that matter, can sometimes still orient towards this kind of native-like standard. I think the only way to do it is for the interactional competence and the ELF paradigm to kind of come together, if you like. I think that we need to interactional competence has a lot of promising aspects to it. And I think we love to study it because it's fascinating, to look at the discourse and to see what people are doing. But I think we also have this problem, that people achieve things interactionally in many, many different ways. And I don't quite know how we can get away from that if we're going to then create, scales of interactional competence and so on. It's a real challenge, I think. But I think one thing that we can do is to, look not necessarily at how things are being performed or how well things are being performed, but how successful is that interaction? And that's why I'm kind of very interested in these tasks that have more objective outcomes. So is the task actually completed? If so, then the interaction was to some extent successful. May not be pretty, but it worked. And in some contexts, that's all we want to know. Aviation English, for example, we may be less concerned. In fact, we don't want people to get into sort of elaborate interpersonal politeness strategies. We just want quick transactional accommodation to achieve a safe and risk-free outcome. So these are the kinds of things I'm thinking about. But it's a great question, Bianca. Yeah.
Here, I'll stop in case you want to see the results of our poll, because I think everybody's replied to it, the last one.
Oh yeah, I forgot about the poll. Okay.
Well, here we are. So it's there's a clear winner there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, great. That's kind of where I am as well. It's a challenging issue, but we need to try and make more progress. And that's what we're doing here, I think, talking about this. And some people are, saying we need to make changes right now. And, I think that's great as well, because it shows that there's a strong desire to embrace this more. And I think that's from where I am, encouraging and affirming that some of the stuff I've been thinking about is people think is important as well. Great.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And we've got time for more questions, but I just want to
Yeah.
say to anyone out there that this is being recorded and we will upload it to our Duolingo English Test Research YouTube channel and share it out. So if you're not able to stick around until the to the hour mark, that's fine. You can catch up, but we've got another 20 minutes of question time. If you'd like me to move on to the next one, I can.
Let's go. Yeah.
Great. So let's see. What is your opinion of L2 accents used in semi-scripted listening tasks? And what is the relation between ELF and semi-scripted listening tasks?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. So semi-scripted, I guess, meaning that there is some latitude for speakers to add some features of natural communication and so on, rather than being entirely scripted or entirely kind of ad lib, if you like. Yes, I totally approve of it. I don't know if it might have come through, but I kind of feel like, yes, I feel we're ready to kind of embrace L2 accents and a whole range of accents in listening assessment. And I feel like the research is there for us to make a sound decision, whether there's a speaker selection process to make sure that speaker is broadly intelligible to a whole range of listeners and so on, fine. But I think the research is there to say, yes, it's possible. And, the bias effects, if there are any, are quite negligible. There are people who will disagree with me, I know that, but, this is my stance. I think it's fine. I think it should happen. I wonder, Miha, whether your question is coming from the place of, and this is something that I mentioned, Joanna Motteram's work, looking at localizing a test for to use sort of Singaporean accents in a Singaporean setting. And I think one of the issues they came up against is, are we just changing the speaker's accent, or are we also changing other dialect features, that would be expected in that context as well? And if that's the case in semi-scripted listening tasks, those, additional features would come through as well. I mean, again, I would say yes, embrace it. If it's domain relevant and construct relevant, go for it. But of course, these things need to be trialed and piloted and so on. But that would be my view. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got another one. So this person says, this is actually my colleague, Dr. Ramsey Cardwell. He says he knows monolingual English speakers who are undeniably C2 level in production, but struggle to understand familiar or non-normative varieties. So the question is, what is the current thinking, yours or in the field, on whether ELF is entirely part of the ELP construct versus a related but distinct construct?
Yeah. Yeah, okay, good question, Ramsey. So I'm not sure what the view from the field is. It may well be that the field doesn't have a unified view. I think that my view is it's quite likely that it's not part of a traditional ELP construct. Okay, and again, it really depends on how we're defining an ELP construct as well, whether it's primarily a kind of lexico-grammatical, psycholinguistic construct, or whether it's a much more elaborate kind of communicative competence construct. But you're right, I think there are many monolingual English speakers who may struggle with different varieties and so on. It touches on other aspects, intercultural competence is one. And so something we didn't talk about, but, is, I think, extremely important and has come through in some of the other work I've done as well, is attitudes and ideologies are really, really bound up in all of this. So there's great work from Stephanie Lindemann many years ago now, looking at how attitudes impacted on, in fact, one of those map tasks, and she selected speakers who had sort of quite positive attitudes towards, I think, if I remember correctly, it was Korean accented speakers and also people who had sort of negative attitudes towards that accent, and found that the attitudes actually made a difference in how successful the communication with those speakers was. So there's an attitudinal dimension here that we have to tackle, and the fact that you bring up monolingual English speakers, I mean, I didn't really get to talk about it much, but when we're talking about assessment here, I think we need to broaden what we're thinking of. And I don't mean we necessarily need to go out and test everybody and put up more barriers and more gates. But what we want to do is use assessment to identify and diagnose, if you like, communication issues. And this could mean going into, university campuses and running, varieties of English awareness kind of training, where we actually look at the other side as well, the listener side, and try to promote receptive accommodation as well. There's a whole range of things that we can be doing here. So yes, I've gone really off track what you originally asked. I think it probably is a distinct construct, and I'm not sure if it's necessarily, and that's why, I'm not sure if it's necessarily the case that it can easily be just kind of tacked on or integrated into existing English language proficiency exams. I think what it may need to be is more of a standalone measure that can be useful for kind of diagnostic purposes and helpful for people who, are trying to navigate these domains of language use.
All right. I've got another question. I think it's a very interesting one. For us here at the DET, especially. So this person's curious to know how much you would suggest that international tests decide which varieties or accents to include in listening tasks. Should inclusion be based on frequency in global TLU domains or some other criteria, assuming we're not allowing test takers to choose the variety?
Okay. Right. So this is Ben's question, I think. Yeah. So how would you, so international tests decide which varieties of accents to include? Yes. Frequency and global, yeah. Okay, good, great question, Ben. So I think in some cases, yes, the TLU domain should be the basis for how we kind of select accents and how they appear in a listening test. I think that when you have a test that is being used for a very specific purpose, that is often, a bit easier to accomplish. I think the challenging bit comes when you have a test that I think, as you're hinting at here, has a sort of global reach. And in that case, yeah, I think it becomes more challenging for the test developer. I mean, the easy answer there is to say, well, maybe the problem is with the model of the international test. Maybe we shouldn't have tests that are trying to be assessing language proficiency across all domains using the same materials or the same content, because I mean, it just, in some ways, it can never match up to what's in the domain. But I recognize that, there are large-scale international tests out there. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that probably the best course of action is looking, at global TLU domains, but also looking at, and some of the work that Oh-Kim Kang and Sun-Yong Shin have been doing with speaker selection and looking at intelligibility thresholds for different speakers. I think there's an argument that above a certain level of intelligibility, any speaker should be able to be used on a particular listening test. And so it becomes just a case of determining where that threshold is and what works. Now, I know that there are criticisms of that approach, and there are potentials for bias with shared L1 listeners and so on. But as I said earlier, I think that with the right kind of process of speaker selection, those that bias is often going to be quite negligible. And I think we talk about bias in terms of this kind of test taker fairness and so on. But I think we also have to recognize that language tests exist in a sort of ecology, of language ideologies. And language tests are powerful players in how English language ideologies work in the world. And it is also important to consider the and because I'm talking about bias, we're talking about issues of fairness, issues of justice, social justice. There is an important counter argument that says that there's the strong rationale for tests to represent the full variety of kind of sociolinguistic diversity is enough, I think, to counterbalance small elements of bias at an item level. But I recognize that might be a less palatable argument for the psychometricians out there in the audience. So, okay, but I think we can possibly find some common compromise by looking at careful speaker selection and proceeding from there.
I think we have time for just one more question
Mm-hmm.
before we're at time. And this comes from Linda Taylor. And she asks, so you rightly note a potential disconnect between the fruits of recent ELF-related research and the extent to which the outcomes are taken up and applied in practical activities, practical testing activities by major test providers. What do you think are the key reasons for this, and how can they be overcome?
Yeah.
Just
Thanks,
quickly.
Linda. Hi, Linda. Yeah, very quickly, multiple reasons, I think. I think what we've already discussed, which is, these kind of fairness concerns, and they're real concerns, and we're all, many of us here are aware of the tester's responsibility for that. I've said elsewhere that there is a kind of institutional conservatism, I think, in many testing organizations, and I don't mean that in a kind of necessarily, critical way of individuals there, but I just think that the way that tests run, large-scale tests, massive amounts of development work, and high-stakes decisions being made, there is an obvious kind of reluctance to make big changes, and I think that that is certainly involved in the kind of reluctance to take up some of that research and move it forward. And also, there's, obviously, I think, a commercial or marketing aspect as well, and that maybe in some markets, some test takers may not be ready or be approving of such changes, and that's something that's also very difficult. So I think there's a whole host of reasons, but I guess my personal view is we're not ever going to be able to produce that piece of research that just says, yes, this is definitely not going to have any impact on anything at the score level, totally safe. I just don't think it's going to happen. I think at some point it needs to move from the empirical research, and it's great that that's being done. And I'm really pleased that a lot of the testing organizations are supporting that kind of research. But I think it at some point needs to move into a policy decision among testing organizations. And yeah, and I think that hopefully at some point we'll see more movement in that direction. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we'll probably have to end questions because I think we're running out of time, but I want to thank everyone, and I've replied individually to those who there are a few we didn't get to, but maybe we'll follow up after the webinar is over to reply. But thank you for all of you out there. And Anthony, you're still there? I don't know if you want to say a few words, but thank you very much, Luke, for the lecture.
Thank you, everybody. It's been a nice experience. Yeah.
And we'll, as I said, we have this recording. We'll put it up, and we'll send that out. If you're not on our mailing list, you can go ahead and drop your email in the chat, or you can DM it to me, and I can add you, so that when we share out the recording, you'll be able to view it at your leisure. But yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, and thanks everyone who's writing in the chat. I don't know if everybody can see the chat or just us, but
Everybody can see the chat now.
everyone can see the chat.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah. No, it's great. And it's nice to see some familiar names too. So.
Wonderful. Yes. Yes, thank you very much. We'll be in touch about future webinars. We'll be in touch about the recording for this one. If you're interested in Luke Harding's research, he is online, and you can look him up and learn more about the work that he does. And we will look forward to the next installment in our webinar series. Thank you, everyone.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.